Okay, so hello everyone, welcome. I would like to welcome our distinguished guests and audience for today's session. My name is Maria Bouzaid. I will be hosting this panel that is addressing mainly the media framing of political events in Lebanon. We will deal with this topic from an academic, activist, and professional perspective. So the panel is organized by the Middle East and Islamic Studies program at George Mason University, the Arab Studies Institute, and the Asfari Institute at the American University of Beirut, and is part of a big project co-sponsored by around 17 research institutions. If we want to talk about the format, each speaker will have between 10 and 15 minutes, and then we will have a wrap up with our discussant for today, Dr. Adel Skandar, and then we will open the floor for discussion, and we will be taking the questions from the Facebook comments section. So please feel free to post and to put your questions in the comments section on our Facebook page. So we will start today with our speakers that also you can find their bios in the feed on Facebook. We will start with Dr. Hatem El-Hibri, an assistant professor of film and media studies at George Mason University. The research and teaching interests of Dr. Hibri focus on global and transnational media, visual culture, Lebanon, and the Middle East. His first book, titled Visions of Beirut, The Urban Life of Media Infrastructure, is finally out. So Dr. El-Hibri, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Maria, and it's so great to be here with such a distinguished group of speakers. So being invited to speak on this panel, I see as an opportunity for a conversation to reflect on the moving train that Lebanon is currently on. And I want to take us back to October 17, because I think some of the transformations in media reportage around October 17 tell us something about where we are right now. It's not just that October 17, an economic collapse that emerged within, it can feel like they're 500 years away. But there's a way that what happens there sort of presages and shapes the pandemic, and how the pandemic itself came to be apprehended and presented in especially news media, I'm thinking. And then also in turn, the travesty of the August port explosion. I think it's because there's like this succession of events, which many people who I speak to speak of them as though they are part of like a series, that they're sort of one leads to the other in a way that now feels inevitable, that I think it's crucial to begin with October 17. Now, what I'm really interested in to talk about today and to try to analyze and also hear from my co-panelists is the question of live media, not just live TV broadcasting, but the other broader range of live media which emerged and defined and have defined these events, not just video capture live, but also things like live streaming on social media, which of course is itself not separate from the major news networks in Lebanon. Like for those of us who live outside, we were keeping in touch with a lot of this stuff through like Al Jadid's like live stream on YouTube and other places. And so live media and the publicness of these events to me are critical to understand. Now I'm going to take an analysis of framing to refer to the manner in which these events are portrayed. And paying attention to how they are portrayed, I think, is important for two main reasons. First, how they are portrayed makes the events themselves feel like a distinct event. October 17 is an event, and how it comes to feel like a specific event is bound up with live media. So the second point, sorry, I got a technical message. The second thing is that considering the form of the reporting can tell us important things about a paradox which has emerged in Lebanon, but not only in Lebanon, and this is the paradox of permanent crisis, right? Permanent crisis as a political way of being, but also a paradox which creates real challenges to representability as a whole and to news reportage in particular. right? There's a challenge to representability that is implied. I think part of that challenge is the deeply affective nature of these events. It's not just the public trauma that are revolutions or the catastrophic and traumatic experience of the port explosion. It's the way that these things are framed for most people, and also I think for many practicing reporters, for many activists, that you are not separate from the thing which is being represented, or which you find yourself having to represent. So these two points, right? The what makes these events coherent and the paradox of permanent crisis. I think if we take these together, this can help us understand this affective turn in news reportage, which takes different forms in the different outlets that we have. I'm thinking of TV news in particular here. So my scholar and friend, colleague, Ahmed El-Ghazi, has suggested for us the term affective proximity to understand reporting in the Syrian crisis, right, which describes this complicated positionality of presenting to the world information, news, on-the-ground reporting of events which sort of surround, maybe directly threaten the safety of the reporter, or at the very least overwhelm them in an emotional sense. This affective framing of live media, this for me is very interesting, it's very curious. Part of what happens beginning with October 17 and then onwards is the political is reintroduced as a scandal. I'm thinking here of Tar el-Haris's understanding of scandal and fadiha, in which evidence of the crimes of authority are brought into evidence in part through personal experience and testimony, right? By the fact of commonly relatable frustrations and debilitations. It's very difficult to think about Lebanon without thinking about debilitation. Everyone is debilitated. Just surviving becomes debilitated. And this extends even for people who thrive in a fresh dollar economy, right? Like there's people who have fresh dollars and can get by. So this live media becomes paired with a direct address. I'm speaking to you live from here, and here's what's happening. I think that this takes a particular constellation in October 17 and a couple of months after. I think there's three lineages that inform it, that can help us contextualize it. The first is the evolution of talk shows and reality TV in Lebanon, in which sort of very personal modes of public address had a long-standing place. People come on and they declare, they denounce, they shout back at the interviewer, or the interviewer shouts back at members in the audience. The second is the tradition of like person on the street interviews that are a staple of the news landscape in general. It's not hard to put a camera crew and reporter on Hamada and you stop people and what do you think of this crap which just happened, and you get some kind of eloquent, polite, deferential, or angry response, right? The third source would be the robust tradition of the first-person address and documentary and citizen-uploaded video from the Arab uprisings of 2011, right? This third source turns on the sense of unfiltered authenticity that is imparted by sort of either amateur or accidental capture. I was just a person who happened to be here, and I had my camera, I had my phone, and here's what I saw. Incidentally, this was also one of the ways that, even though I was in the US at the time of the Thawra, both Jan 25 and October 17, in October 17 and onwards, like friends or family would just call me from the middle of a protest and just no comment, just WhatsApp video, and there's stuff burning and people running or people hanging out and talking. And sometimes people just like do that to me and then hang up without saying anything to me. This starts to feel like an unmediated encounter, right? That unmediated sense, that unfiltered, we are coming to you and just showing you what's happening, comes to define a range of mediated encounters, a range of ways that media frame these things, either by the media or just by social media technologies, so on. Now, to say that these are very affective is not to discount or undersell the incredible work that investigative journalists and the incredible work of investigative reporting, which begins in October 17 and continues to the present day. But so to start us, before we get to October 17, there's something which sort of clues me into this and I see as informing what comes after. And this is on October 15th, in the middle of the wildfires, when Halima al-Tabi'a, reporting to Al-Jadid from close proximity to the fires, starts weeping on camera, overwhelmed by what she is seeing. This is not bearable, and she's describing people burning to death in buildings behind her, and she's describing hearing the screams to the audience. So, personal testimony of the reporter, of people on the ground, average people on the ground to a news reporter, proliferate in this period. Reporters on the street giving testimony proliferates. You have versions of this that happen in the Kalam al-Nas audience, people who will speak directly and in a way that starts to feel, wow, like, I can't believe that person just said that on live TV. There's a different version of this, which Megaphone adopts, the montage with no comment segments, where the editing itself is sort of the narration of what is happening. This itself lends itself to this sense of authenticity, of an unfiltered, unmediated encounter. There's also a different version of this where, like, people do actually sort of grab the mic or say things on a live mic that perhaps the reporter or the editorial unit of that station didn't intend. This is the guy who this is sort of the eruption of joyous profanity in the October 17 revolution. The guy who famously says on camera, I don't want to send him a message, I want to F him up, right? This sort of joyous overturning of the systems of deferentiality, which defined political patronage networks. Now, I don't want it to sound, if I sound almost nostalgic for October 17, it's only because of the sharp contrast that this can draw with the ongoing crisis that is the new normal. You know, theorists of televisuality and media theory, they give us the insight that liveness is a way of managing contingency, right? The world is radically contingent. Different things can happen at any point in time. This is part of why they feel like they help us understand what's happening in a revolution, because revolutions are radically contingent, right? Live talk and analysis isn't just cheaper to run. It also helps us feel like we can get a handle on something that's unfolding, particularly when the possibility of collapse feels imminent, right? So this is the way that news starts to feel like an ongoing TV serial, but added with the element of breaking news. You don't just have to tune in at 8 p.m. tomorrow to find out what happened. You also have to find out what actually just happened. The constant updates about whether or not a government will be formed, about pandemic numbers, about the exchange rate of the lira, about did the banks announce a new policy. It becomes a version of trying to read the stars for our fate. It also becomes a way of hoping for a miracle, waiting for divine intervention, which takes the form of the political class deciding amongst themselves how much of the crumbs that are left in the country they're going to divide between each other. The last comment on liveness isn't the last thing to happen historically. This last comment on liveness is about witnessing and the blast. And what I find myself coming to here is when I look at this footage, I look at the films which are being produced about this, there's a way that live witness becomes tied to the media of continuous replay, right? Mm-hmm. Of continuously rewinding to the moment of the blast or just before the blast, and then replaying what happens over and over and over again, right? So the moment of the blast and this constant replay, this is actually kind of like a visual allegory for the catastrophic inside of the crisis, which itself becomes the new normal. On the one hand, the blast is intolerable, that it could have happened is intolerable. And it also sort of is like, yeah, it happened. And then sort of we went back to the pandemic and the glass gets put back in and we continuously replay the footage over and over. That moment of live and accidental witness comes to be the frame through which we come to understand Lebanon's ongoing collapse and the vast scale of immiseration which underpins it. And I have the comment here that I have 1 minute, and that is actually the end of my comment. So I'm really excited to hear from George, Dima, Ayman, and to hear Maria, your and Adil's thoughts as well.
Incredibly inspiring, Hatem. Thank you very, very much. So we will move to Dima. Dr. Dima Isa is a senior lecturer of mass media and communication at the University of Beirut in Lebanon. Her research interests revolve around Arab diaspora and media consumption, as well as gender and representations. Before academia, Dima worked in the corporate sector in media relations, as well as in broadcast journalism. Dima.
Can you hear me, Maria?
Yes.
Sorry, I just need to
take your time.
Can you hear me from the computer?
Yes, it's perfect now.
Wonderful. Okay, great. Thank you so much. And thank you, Hatem. That really was a wonderful presentation, and I'm really excited to discuss it further. So what I'm looking at today is this idea of soundscapes, participatory culture, and the Lebanese uprising. So the October 17th uprisings across Lebanon were an accumulation of anger, frustration from years of incompetence, corruption, and divisive politics. And as a mediated event, it was so rich in visuals and soundscapes. And it also allowed for insight into political, social, and cultural discourses in the country. And one of the main reasons why I was so interested in looking at this idea of soundscapes was the article by The Guardian in which they utilized voice notes and sound bites from people around the scene to kind of build a story and create a narrative around it. And it was so haunting that they were utilizing such personal kind of like pieces to really build that story. And from there on, that's where this idea of soundscapes really kind of like was something that I wanted to focus on. In Lebanon, as we know, there are 9 local TV channels, with the exception of Tele Liban, are politically affiliated and politically funded. The other channels are highly polarized with content mostly reflecting the ideologies and opinions of the political parties and their allies. And an excellent resource for this is the Media Ownership Monitor on screen, which provides a really great detailed kind of breakdown of those different channels. Those channels during the protests were criticized for showcasing a mostly one dimension of the protests. What Diala Al-Taif says, a means by which to emphasize their own implicated positionality, basically showcasing their own perspectives related to their own political agendas of the protests themselves. Now, alternative voices came out during this time on various social media platforms, and Al-Taif provides an excellent kind of outline and overview of that on the Jadaliya website. So I'm not going to, focus on that. Yes, okay. So the purpose of this presentation, what I will be focusing on are some of these sites, looking at how they were visually and sonically informing the public on what was happening on the streets during the uprisings in the context of space, affect, and agency. So, for this research, I was able to interview some key activists who were on the ground during the time, as well as the founders and content creators of social media pages that took off throughout the uprisings, and musicians who produced music during the protest. But for the sake of time, I'll be focusing on 2 Instagram pages, which I looked at discursively and visually to look at the way that the different types of content that they produced during the uprisings. So Shannon argues that music is society. It brings together different social forces, contradictions of culture, and the Lebanese uprisings of October 17 were not only a visual revolution, but also a vocal one. From chants that took on life and created new forms of everyday discourse, to dance parties and outdoor raves, streets around Lebanon were full of protesters, flags, burning tires, and music. Perhaps the most popular witness to all of this was a video that went viral, broadcast across international channels like CNN and BBC, where a group of protesters who had blocked the road began singing Baby Shark to soothe an anxious baby in a car. These were vibrant protests with public lectures and teach-ins highlighting the need for collective action and unity. The soundtracks accompanying the crowds were hopeful and determined, poking fun at the politicians like Hela Hela Ho and the assertive Killon Yani Killon. This was a stark contrast to the explosion of August 4th, where 2,750 tons of ammonium nitrate jolted the country with the equivalent of a 3.5 magnitude earthquake and muted the air with devastating loss. The screams, the cries, the broken glass, the crumbling of buildings and of dreams. Beirut was broken. In the aftermath, the sweeping of debris and shards of glass, the volunteers, the sounds of international aid, the barks of a dog who could smell life under the rubble were all muffled by the silence of those in power who said nothing, admitted nothing, and did nothing. It was the silence that was loudest of all. I have some examples here. I don't know if I have enough time. I just want to show you a small clip of just kind of how vibrant, those soundscapes were. This was from Tripoli, where DJ Mahdi, who I was actually able to interview for this, presentation, he basically set up a deck and just started playing music. So. It was really a dynamic and interactive kind of session during the protests as well. There were different ones as well. This other one I'm not going to show you, but I just have it there for reference because I know that I don't have a lot of time. But there were also some other songs which were quite patriotic, nationalistic, coupled with the chants and old political speeches. So you had all these different vibrant soundscapes present there. Dissertal talks about this idea of space, right? He talks about how space is at the intersection of different elements. I wanted to quote here one of the participants, Dr. Rania Musti, who's a political activist and was on the ground from the beginning. And she was explaining the way some protesters were setting up these huge speaker systems, which she found unconstructive. And I'm quoting her when I say, if you're trying to have such a large speaker system, what is it that you're trying to do? Because there can't be conversation with a large speaker system. There's only domination. And this notion of dominating space and also the soundscapes is significant because it showcases how the space in Martyr Square and arguably elsewhere was a space that was also contested. So coming into this discussion of a participatory culture, Henry Jenkins talks about this at length, this idea of, wanting to share information. When people are participating, they're sharing, they're creating content, and they're trying to form some form of social connection with another. And of course, this pairs very kind of deeply with affect and this idea of, individuals with communities, like Sarah Ahmed talks about, this idea of body and social space and the way that affect is produced through social space and through the body. And, I know that Hatem spoke a little bit about this idea of effective proximity. Omar Ghazi, who talks about this in his discussion on citizen journalism in Syria, this idea of, emotionally entangled with the events that are happening, this kind of, being so submerged within the event and also effectively kind of trying to report it, that there is no kind of distance there between, the emotion that is created through those times. And again, this idea that, he talks about this idea of a citizen journalism narrative, and he talks about the nation state as the political space through which to conceive the use of new technologies. And so looking at this nation state as political space and understanding how digital space is navigated through forms of participatory culture, it can be argued that space, digital and experienced, function in a polyvalent unity of conflictual programs and contractual proximities, to come back to Desserteau. Thus, digitized space is a reflection of experienced political space and similarly functions as contested and reclaimed. So from here, I'm going to look at the ways in which these Instagram pages, Fawda Media and Political Pen, kind of looked at and kind of covered the uprisings. So Fawda Media on Instagram began posting content during the uprisings. The page consists of short vignettes, usually to the music of Fayrouz, interviews with key people on the ground. So they interviewed lawyers, doctors, artists, psychologists, people who were there, who were in the square, but were providing services to some extent to the protesters. The interviews were conducted in the form of a conversation with participants facing the camera and talking about the services that they were offering. And in a discussion with Jean-Claude Boulos, one of the co-founders of Fawda Media, I was asking him, what was the rationale behind his page? And he was basically talking about, they were watching television and they wanted to fill the gaps. They wanted to highlight the change makers, the people on the streets, so a more cultural and social kind of perspective of the Thawda. And again, these are some videos. I don't think I have enough time, but I mean, these are really great kind of indicators of what kind of video content they were producing. So, they had a video on how to protect yourself from tear gas with, an ambulance, one of the volunteer ambulance, people on the first aiders, on the scene, how they were talking about how to protect yourself from tear gas, what you should do if you were hit by tear gas, especially when the protests took quite a violent turn. And then we have Political Pen, which is a very kind of different format to Fawda. So Fawda was much more about culture and social issues. It looked at, it highlighted these key people on the ground that were more cultural than political. Whereas Political Pen were more about, breaking news. I mean, they had started their page 2 years prior to the revolution, but also this idea that they would post content quite regularly. So this content was not only produced by them, but also pulled in from other people through this participatory kind of nature of sharing. And so a lot of videos are quite violent. They show tensions between the protesters and the police when certain political people would send their followers into the streets to beat them. So there was very kind of political. The content was also quite provocative. They would post a picture of a politician, and they would ask them, what do you think, thoughts of this person, but also interactive in the sense that they would conduct polls and vote on this kind of thing. They would have political speeches, old ones, Gibran Twani's famous speech, and more recent ones as well. They would look at comics. They would recontextualize images from movies such as V for Vendetta, trying to recontextualize them within the framework of the uprising. And then on August 4th, they show different kind of perspectives of the bombing using CCTV cameras, different phone cameras, and so providing kind of like a multi-dimensional perspective of those August 4 blasts. And so for Pierre Nahas, the creator of Political Pen, his rationale was that he wanted to revolutionize how young people think. So he wanted, to bring clarity to the public, something new that was missing since the traditional media, again, back to this discussion that it was a political regime. To them. So trying to oppose that kind of like perspective that's been given throughout the years. Again, these are some videos. I don't think I have time, so I don't want to. But I mean, they're really beautiful in their content. And I do want to talk about this notice that political pen kind of, placed on their page, this idea that, trying to streamline, the activity that was going on. So, their advice was commit to patriotic and revolutionary songs only, stay away from joking through going live or even on social media. And number 3, there's no real benefit from insulting anyone. The revolution will not pay off through insulting all day long. And this is quite reminiscent of another discussion I had with some activists who were talking about how language played a huge role in voicing the revolution. So what was the voice of the revolution? Was it Arabic? Was it English? Everyone was very kind of, most of the participants were very kind of like, Arabic needs to be the official language of the uprising. And this was something interesting that I thought, that was taking place as well. Then we had Dalil al-Thawra. I'm not going to talk too much about it, but I mean, Dalil al-Thawra did something really interesting, was that it began posting content, on their Instagram pages. But what they were doing was that they were creating an interactive map at the onset of the uprising. So people were able to know where the protests were. They could go join them, or if they wanted to avoid them because of traffic. But, it was this, this kind of like collaboration of, this is where we are, come here if you want to, whatever is easy, that kind of thing. Then, after the uprising, it ended up being, this map was used to kind of like showcase the whereabouts of politicians in public spaces. This was a big thing where people would go and shame them in public spaces if they were having if they were in a restaurant having dinner or whatever. So this was another tool that was used to find out where they were. So, it's important to understand sound and music as key elements in this discussion of space, digital media, and the uprisings. So throughout the uprisings, chants and music by the protesters were heard all across media channels. There was no mainstream music artist that emerged as the voice of the revolution. In other countries like Tunis and in Egypt, I don't know if I'm running out of time, but I'm almost done, I promise. There was always somebody that emerged as kind of like that voice of the revolution, but this was not the case here. Unfortunately, a lot of our mainstream singers are also associated politically. There was that discussion as well. On August 2nd, 2020, there was an uproar after a famous song, Ya Beirut Ya Sitt Dunya by Majd al-Rumi, written by Nizar Qabbani, was censored during the Army Day celebrations. The line, "The revolution is born from the womb of sorrows," was taken out. Now, I'm not going to go into details about that, but it's important to note that, in November 2020, the death metal band Chimera covered the song, and it caused huge controversies among her fans. And, one of the arguments that I make is that, this dispute brings to the forefront further discussions regarding nationhood and its representations. This idea of does Majd al-Rumi represent Lebanon, or does Cheryl Khairallah represent Lebanon? And drawing on Silva's discussion on representation of nation and nationalism, she talks about this idea of feminized images which define the iconography of the nation. So what is the iconography of the nation in this scenario? Is it the old traditional music, or is it the newer kind of forms of creative, constructive songs that are being put out there? So these different online platforms allow for various forms of agency with regards to information and content creation. At times, these platforms confuse the distinction between objectivity and opinion. The positioning of the content from the perspective of the protester already positions them according to an agenda. However, in the case of Lebanon, this is nothing but an organic development of a polarized media landscape. Not only was there mass mobilization through experienced and physical space, there was also mobilization of information through digital space. Essentially, the uprisings brought to the forefront not only the need to reclaim physical and experienced space, but also to reclaim mediated and digital space. Thank you so much, and I'm sorry if I went over.
Thank you very much, Dima. Thank you for this extremely insightful presentation and the way you have put things together. So thank you. I think also Ayman will have something also very new and very important to how we are dealing with this topic and with the alternative media and traditional media. So we will move next to Ayman. Ayman Mhanna is the Executive Director of Samir Asir Foundation, which is one of the leading freedom of expression and media development NGOs in the region. Ayman was also the executive director of the Global Forum for Media Development. He holds a bachelor's degree in economics from St. Joseph University in Beirut and a master's degree in international affairs from Sciences Po Paris. Ayman?
Thank you very much. I'm truly impressed by the presentations of Hatem and Dima. And although I also teach at university, I don't feel part of the same league when it comes to the ability to reference things, to use multi-syllable words in the same seamless way. So bear with me. I look at it from more, the perspective of an organization that has been trying to help journalists on a daily basis. And I'll go back to many points that Dima and Hatem raised brilliantly, but I will focus always on trying to compare how traditional legacy television stations on the one hand and digital native alternative platforms on the other hand covered the same events moving forward. There were definitely points in time when their coverage was convergent at some point, but there were fundamental differences that I would like to highlight. First, without going into details, I'd just like to make sure that the terminology I'm using is clear enough. When I'm talking about traditional media, specifically here, television. Dima mentioned the 9 TV stations, but I'll focus on 6 in particular. 3 of them are directly political party owned, OTV, NBN, and Al Manar, and 3 of them are politically leaning businessmen owned, LBCI, Al Jadid, and MTV. The focus will be on the 3 non-party owned, so LBCI, MTV, and Al Jadid, given the multitude of political, economic interests they're involved with rather than a one-party line. And then when I'm talking about digital native alternative media, I'm going to divide between 3 categories. The first category is relatively older. It's the series of LebanonSomething.com. And these are not necessarily the kind of alternative media I'm thinking about. These are mainly aggregators, copy-pasters, very often no intellectual property respecters kind of organizations, just, fill-in pages. I'm not talking about them. I'm not talking either about individuals who have very wide platforms such as Ghaid Shammas or Gino Raide, or even Jad Ghosn right now, who just sit behind their screen or are present on the ground and report on what is happening. I am focusing here on a series of media organizations that developed editorial newsroom teams inside. So where there is a media newsroom style of decision-making when it comes to how they will cover a certain event. Dima mentioned Political Pen. I can definitely refer to Megaphone, Daraj, Beirut Today, The Public Source, As-Safir Al-Arabi, and some others. So these are mostly the ones I will focus on. Hatem started very clearly with this idea of live coverage, especially around October 17, 2019. We saw it also in 2015, but definitely not to the extent of October 17, 2019, this live coverage open mic and on traditional media. And this definitely was one of the most interesting phenomena when it comes to, on the positive side, giving access, giving visibility, giving a platform to people who historically have been voiceless. And this was very important. The idea also to show that many people across the country from different backgrounds are having the same kind of grievances. But then we quickly fell into no context, non-stop, repetitive, and it actually started to show that people are here just because of their own personal direct interest. I want milk, I want better electricity, I want water. Yes, all of these are very valid demands, but it started to show or plant the seeds of an argument that will later be used by the traditional political parties. Hey, you're only demanding things. So if we give you a box of milk and oil, that's fine. Or you see, you don't have any political leadership, you don't have any political vision. So they actually capitalized on this live coverage, non-stop open mic in order to undermine the real demand, which was accountability. I'll move to the alternative digital native media. Here, we also gave voice to the voiceless. But there was this editorial work that Hatem and Dima mentioned by trying to pick and choose faces of the revolution, not necessarily leaders, but faces, whether relief workers, people who were distributing food, people who were organizing the safety, people who were organizing debates, discussions. So this idea of giving human faces and storytelling from the perspective of actors of the revolution is the angle that was chosen by the alternative media. Also speed of coverage and the geographic distribution. This was something that was very important. We released it in a study that the Samir Kassir Foundation released in December 2020 with Friedrich Naumann Foundation. We focus grouped citizens, 18 to 25-year-old students in rural and urban areas, to ask them about the appeal of these alternative platforms. And they specifically mentioned two of them, Above and Beyond, that appeared clearly for us as the main sources of information for the 18 to 25 students, university students, Megaphone and Political Pen. And why is that? Because they were present with us on the ground in West Bekaa when we were demonstrating. LBCI, MTV, and Al Jadid were there, but they didn't necessarily tell the story how it was happening on the ground. They actually picked and chose who appeared, whereas Megaphone and Political Pen's guys and young women were present on the ground. So this very strong connection with the ground through people who look like us, speak like us, and reflect our ideas, created this very strong level of trust in these new alternative platforms among the youth. And it created something very deep. The level of gap, I mean, the width of the gap today, generational gap in terms of media consumption is unprecedented. Our parents are not even aware of the very existence of Megaphone, Political Pen, so on and so forth. Whereas the 18 to 25 completely stopped following any newspaper. Completely. TV is still present, but it's absolutely not anymore how they get their news. So this is something really interesting because we don't know yet its political translation. I'll move now to the second level, which is the narrative. Quickly after the very first days on October 17, the narrative of the traditional media focused on the violent people, whether coming from the political parties attacking violently the demonstrators, or violence coming from the Tripoli people, or the who are coming to Beirut, as if, you know, we live in two different countries, and suddenly why are the young guys from Tripoli and Akkar coming to Beirut to be violent? So this was a very strong focus of the narrative of the traditional media to undermine the revolution. Why are you here? This constant thing of why are you here and where are you coming from combined, saying, okay, if you're Sunni from Akkar, why are you in Ashrafiyya, and things like that. So it became such a repetitive question that was truly problematic in terms of how the youth responded to it. Also, we shifted from discussing accountability to discussing the technique. So what's good? Organizing a yoga session on the ring, or demonstrating in front of politicians' house, or blocking the road, main road, or side roads. So they completely shifted the discussion into the technique and to the issue, should we insult or not insult? Why are you singing instead of showing us who is your leader? So the media, instead of looking at what is the issue at stake, it's corruption, it's lack of accountability, it's the poverty that is, the poverty plague, it became about techniques of showing your discontent. Whereas on the alternative media side, it moved to focusing on the human pain, moved to intersectionality. Just this is probably the longest multi-syllable word I'll use, by showing the connections between the fight for refugee rights, for LGBT right, for reclaiming public space, for war memory, all these topics that have often been forgotten. And you see how many people who belong to different categories are now together working on them or talking about them directly. Also, rediscovering economics. The idea of people rediscussing economics, macroeconomics, interest rates, and Ponzi schemes, I think this was a unique thing to the Lebanese revolution that we haven't seen even in Iraq and Sudan, where the economic issues were at the forefront of the reasons that drove people to the street. But the level of intensity of technical economic discussion was amazing in Lebanon and only reflected truly and deeply in the alternative media scene. And came the stronger level of political cooptation of traditional media with the sudden return of politicians on screen around December. They had completely disappeared, but they managed to dodge the bullet of the first days. They managed to sell to the international community, and Macron is the clearest example of it, that we're irreplaceable. Indirectly, that we don't know who these others are, given this very gray and blurry coverage of the others. So we're irreplaceable, let's come back. And we completely again shift discourse to saying that the crisis began on October 17. And even today, in the very latest central bank decision, I mean, unorthodox, horrible decision. So every penny you had before October 17 is one that you can somehow save today. So as if the economic and financial problem began on October 17. And this is unfortunately something that worked in the discourse. Also, what have you achieved, revolution? So we're asking the revolution what it achieved, instead of asking dynasties that have been in power for 80 and 50 years and armies and militias that have more power than many regular armies in the region, what they achieved. So this idea that they turned the issue of demonstrating the achievement to the demonstration, instead of actually telling us what the ministers and the president and the prime minister have achieved, as if it's not their fault. Also moving the political discourse to the politicking. Okay, who's going to name the last 2 Christian ministers? And this takes like 20% of the, 80% of the media news bulletin. Well, if this guy or that guy named the 2 Christian ministers, what is happening today in terms of access to fuel or access to medicine? So this turning, so, and again, the 3/3, 8 ministers for that guy, 6 ministers for that guy. They brought it back to the very traditional way. And it led to something deliberate. That political discourse is very much in tune with the deliberate decision of the policy of no policy that the Lebanese ruling class has decided. It's not true that they don't know what the solutions are. It's a very deliberate decision not to do anything, because they know that bringing us to poverty and bringing us to violence means bringing us to the status that they know best. They are all initially born out of militias. What militias can do best is patronage and identity-based protection. And they use a media narrative through the traditional media that is very coherent with this deliberate policy to bringing us back to these communal divisions. So deflecting the blame, moving to August 4th, and this is how it'll end. Again, major difference in the coverage. Traditional media is these repetitive messages and all these songs from the Arabic version of Les Miserables, and so drama, the tragedy all the time, instead of accountability. It's true that we saw on Al Jadid, we saw with Edmond Sassine and others, some really good attempts at accountability. But it's accountability that is selective when it comes to let's choose who in the system we don't like, and also accountability, and specifically here, MTV, LBC, and Al Jadid, based on leaks. So Nada Andraos, Maroon Nassif, Edmond Sassine, Ranim Boukhzam, Nicole Hajal on LBCI, and I can name the same ones on MTV or Al Jadid, I'm not pointing them out. Each one of them has political and or security connections, therefore a certain channel of leak to them, not to others, coming from one source only. And same happens in the judiciary sector. So on what we saw on traditional media is leaks that probably are valid and lead to accountability and knowing a little bit more what happened, but it's scattered. Whereas the work we saw on Daraj and on Megaphone, and also through Riyad Qubaisi, but on Daraj, not on Megaphone, not necessarily on Al Jadid, with the support of OCCRP, of Arij, and other investigative journalism missions, led to things related to, who are the people who imported the ammonium nitrate? Many things related to who knew what and when. That didn't appear as logically and methodically on traditional media. And don't tell me this is only out of, editorial time and not having enough time, airtime. So today and moving forward, an organization like mine that is fully invested in freedom of the press, but also media development, is focusing on the following. accountability, accountability, accountability journalism, wherever it comes from. Despite everything I said about the traditional media, we have not taken the decision not to deal with them. So what we're doing is the following. One, we have launched the largest ever accountability investigative journalism program in Lebanon. In the last 4 months alone, we've disbursed nearly $250,000 US. There will be, in addition, 100,000 more in the next 6 months, and probably another 100,000 for a slightly longer period for investigative journalism around governance, the port explosion, and spoliation of international aid to Lebanon. And it's open to everyone, traditional and alternative media. Alternative media has, of course, directly jumped on the occasion. They're used to being grant funded. But there is something really interesting happening with traditional media. Today, even with political funding, their economic situation is not stellar. So they need fresh cash. George knows from his former colleagues at MTV, today, what is the salary of a news anchor on MTV, on LBCI, or on Al Jadid in Lebanese pounds? And very often not necessarily paid on time. So they need cash. We are here with an offer that is also unorthodox. Are you ready for an organization like the Samir Kassir Foundation to fully produce the highest level of investigative stories on your channels, but according to the highest international standards, and you get money, or you want to get money from your typical sources? It created a dilemma. I don't know where it will lead. I don't know if it will definitely create a cultural shift, maybe not with the decision makers, but definitely with the individual journalists who are working on these stories. And we're very proud of their work. But the alternative media, in addition to the grants, we have decided after the blast to tell them the following: don't spend a penny of international funding to buy imported computers, sound systems, cameras. Your equipment will be fully covered by us. We will give each one of these 12 alternative media outlets that I named earlier everything you need in terms of cameras, editing equipment, sound equipment. From now on, every time you get money from IMS, CFI, BBC Media Action, Internews, you name it, use it for content production and to pay salaries to your staff, to journalists, to make them commit to their mission. Because if they cannot survive out of being journalists, they will either be politically co-opted or go to the Gulf, where probably they'll have great salaries and great organizations, but they can only speak about certain issues. Self-censorship becomes part of the menu, or they leave the profession. So we want to avoid these three scenarios. And this is why the idea of economic support for journalists is very important. And finally, thinking with them in a very deep way, and this will open us to a topic we'll talk about probably another panel, on media sustainability and business models, creative business model opportunities for alternative media. This is the only way to sustain accountability journalism. Today, accountability journalism on traditional media is for either political convenience or because we have the money and we're funding it. The moment the funding will disappear, I'm not sure it will continue. The only way it will continue is to make sure the alternative media become financially sustainable and not only dependent on donor funding. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ayman, for this activist, revolutionary presentation. You can call it the way you want. It's really out of the box, and we
intersectionality at some point.
بالعكس, the issue is that we wanted this combination and we want this diversity also in the panel. So thank you very much. And I think George has a lot to say because he was sometimes very approving with your ideas, and sometimes he had like a few comments. I think I can read the body language somehow. So I'm also proud to have George on this panel, because I can say with modesty that when we want to say who was the first one to cover any event in Lebanon, we can say George Eid was the first to cover. So George also, I think when we were preparing for this event, I insisted that George gives us also his experience with covering the blast and with the coverage of the blast. So I think I'm a little bit biased to George because also we taught together for a period of time. Now he is unfortunately in Dubai. He left the country. So George Aid is currently the executive news producer at Al Arabiya news channel in Dubai. He was previously the head of news operation at MTV Lebanon. His documentary Kalimera min Beirut, produced in 2016, has won several international awards. So George, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Dr. Maria. It's always a pleasure to have this discussion with you. I want to say I enjoyed every single intervention, Hatem, Dima, and Ayman. Every single one of you gave me a lot of ideas, a lot to think on. Basically, because more or less, me and Ayman, we come from a similar background. I had a few things that I wrote. I want to answer the question he had. I don't know how it works, he said, with traditional media and money. Well, dear, as long as you have the money, they'll follow. Just pray that you still have the money at the end. No, it's like the political system in Lebanon. As much as you feed it, it will stay alive. You know, the media, let's go back to one main question. The media after the war in Lebanon, or before the war, I remember President Charles Helou had a small joke to say to journalists, "Ahla wa sahla fikum," or "Welcome to your second home, Lebanon." So this is, of course, not the case of all journalists in Lebanon. I don't want to generalize, but this is the case of many media institutions or traditional media institutions in Lebanon. Money has always regulated things and how things work on the media scene. Tele-Liban, of course, is an exception, but then again, how much viewership are we talking about when we talk about Tele-Liban? I love the mention of Megaphone, Daraj, all these media that are not traditional, and I do believe in their role. However, when we talk about media in general, we have to ask a fundamental question: where is the funding coming from? In case of traditional media and in case of alternative media. لأنه, in French, we say celui qui paye ordonne. At the end, those who pay will ask for a certain agenda, be it an agenda that is more relevant to the Western world, or an agenda that is more relevant to another political party that we are witnessing now in Lebanon, which has a leverage in Lebanon, يلي هن today Hezbollah and the media of Hezbollah. And so we have two main opinions in Lebanon, let's say. Money at the end is what's regulating the situation. I've worked in Lebanon with many media outlets at the time of the areas of the blast and October 17. I was the head of operations on MTV, and throughout this year I worked with international outlets as well, يعني Voice of America, Cyprus Mail, which I still write for, and Antenna One, which is a Greek channel. What I could say on one of them could not be said on the other. And of course, it's the relevance of the public that is hearing, but كمان it is what the media scene in Lebanon is about. So here, I want to take you just to a second, so how it all started. لأنه on كان نهار خميس, and it was at 8:35 when I reached home. An old habit, I always follow up the news if I have 5 more minutes. So I was watching the last 5 minutes of MTV Bulletin, and they wrapped up. They went out of they closed. We had the weather segment. We went out and we started our programs. I jumped to LBC. You know, I want to check on the competition. So I saw that LBC was still running. When Din Baladi Beirut, just in front of the municipal building in Beirut, at 8:35, there was around, I estimate, 70 to 100 people. At 8:40, they were multiplied by 2. At 8:45, I had asked for a camera, since a message reached me that the people are gathering at C-Suite on the main highway, Juni, and there was something happening. So I felt as a reporter that there was something going. I couldn't wait. So I ordered a lot of cameras on ground, on standby mode. I told them to just be there for a live position. And we had that night Marcel Ghanem on air. I'm telling you this story because that night is somehow, I'm not judging, I'm just telling you what happened that night. And it can give you an idea where we were on October 17 with the whole scene and what I saw after that. When I arrived there, this was something, on that day particularly, I had done a report about the tax, the WhatsApp tax, the marvelous WhatsApp tax that brought all the system down. I was in charge of that report in MTV at the time. So when I was on the ground, mainly when you are talking about something that came out of sudden, that was not organized, there shouldn't be a certain container to the whole thing. So I was trying to take some vox pops on air live randomly, and I get this guy before going on air who comes to me and says, hey, why do you want to talk to this guy, not to this guy? I said, why should I talk to anyone in particular? I'm just selecting people randomly. And I didn't know the guy, either the one who was directing me, neither the guy in front of me. He said, this is the person who should talk. And here I was very precise to ask him, and who are you? He told me, I am the person organizing you. On October 17, at 10 p.m. at night, someone was organizing, was something that took me by surprise. And I was there in 2005. I was there in 2013. I was there in 2014 in Lebanon on many occasions. The whole clashes we had. So it's not like it's something that is normal to have someone on the ground. It was not someone. It was many people that were organizing that night. So I could not say that the protests in Lebanon were politically free. Acute, and for sure, there was a very big chunk of people, one of them, Anna, I was myself, I was very upset with the system, still am. That's why I left the country. But there was a political influence through the traditional media and hatta on the ground. There was people that were running the show without one other thing that I would like to mention. On my way, just close to NDU, I saw a convoy of 4 or 5 cars with political flags. I took a picture, sent it to our website, and then 5 minutes later, the political party involved, and I know the guys because they are at the university where I teach, so I know their faces. So I got a statement that was published. The picture was removed from the website, and the statement says, our party is not involved in any of this things that are happening this night. It turned out that this political party was much involved in what was happening, and I saw the same people at the end, at the spot where I was covering that night. So that's the other side of things. I'm not saying that they were the whole show. No, I'm just pointing out to another angle of how things were going in Lebanon. Like Ayman said, there was a point where things shifted. All the media was sold to Akbar. They were all in at the beginning. Open air for 7, 5, 8, 9, 10 hours until 4 in the morning, which is a question to ask as well. And we know that the media in Lebanon has always went for money. They need to survive. So opening air for 10, 12, 13 hours made us ask questions. I will not elaborate more, but the air was free and there to be opened, and at a certain point, December, like Ayman mentioned, we had a change in the climate. The politicians were going in again. Akid, those who considered themselves not involved, and for me, everyone is involved in what's happening in Lebanon, were the first to jump in. And then we had those who were going out of the ruling party, al-munshaqoon, or those who deviated from the political party and were announcing that they were resigning from their coalitions or whatever they called it, يعني بوقتها. And then we had a shift. صارنا عم نسأل different questions. We had people that were there. I will tell you something. When you've been around on the ground, as I did, 17 years of doing reporting, you begin to know people. Lebanon is small. It's a town. I know everyone تقريبا who is politically affiliated to someone. It's the same faces that get recycled. And then I get these people telling me, I'm not with this party, I'm just a revolutionary tonight. كيف يعني 220 volts من تقطع بتجي 110 volts, he just switches electric current? It's not that. It's that some political parties were involved, but they didn't want to show that they were involved, because if it went berserk or it turned violent, وراح قتلة and some people were killed, They didn't want the responsibility and the blood on their hands like what happened in 1975 and all through the Civil War. So they were playing it in a different way this time. They've learned the lessons of the past, and they were trying to learn, except the Kataib party was obvious since the beginning. They had a stance about this. So they said we are there to support without our flags. But they were not the only party to be there. The media had a certain agenda, like always, بكل الأحوال. Traditional and non-traditional media. I'm not saying it's a bad agenda, but at a certain point, it was changing, let's say, based on the circumstances. يعني بالنهاية, we know in Lebanon that the amount of TVs and traditional media we have, in newspapers, our TVs, our radio, are too big for our small market. They didn't survive on advertising. I've worked in newspapers, Lebanon, radios, everywhere. بعرف إنه the funding doesn't always come from advertising. It is a big chunk, أكيد, when it comes to what Ayman called the businessman traditional media, يعني MTV, LBC, and Al Jadid. But أكيد, they will be influenced, all three of them, by what I like to call political advertising. And this political advertising is like a swing. نهار, on a good day, we would be revolutionaries. On a bad day, we would turn to something else, whatever that would be. And this can work for non-traditional media as well. And I know what happens in non-traditional media as well. You give me money, I make you God. You don't, the next day you're grilled. And this is something embedded in the culture that needs to be worked in Lebanon. I would say our system is corrupt. Our politicians are to the brain corrupt. كل واحد منهم, every one of them. Every single one that I knew for 17 years is, I will not use the word out of respect for myself, but the people as well are part of this game. This is what I want to say. The people are part of this game. We have a certain schizophrenia. People who were there, politically involved, and who voted for certain political parties were playing revolutionaries. I will give you one incident that happened with me in 2013, the clashes in Tripoli. I was caught in what is called Sharia Syria, or the Syria street. Not a very pleasant place to be caught in, and the mortar is whizzing all around. So, and I had to stay with them as they were shooting each other. Jabal Ali, the people in Jabal Ali who are affiliated with Syria, and the others who are affiliated with other Sunni groups in Tripoli. So there I was sitting and waiting just to go live with Sky News Arabia.
Jabal Muhsin.
Jabal Muhsin. وبوقتها كان في علي عيد. I had a very bad name at the time. George Aid, Ali Aid, didn't mix. I was down on the other side. So 2013, I get this guy in the morning. I was staying at an hotel called Holiday Inn, I guess, in Tripoli. And I had this nice guy who I had a conversation with in the morning, who was telling me we are fed up with the situation. خلاص. يعني they are killing us, these politicians. In the afternoon, when I was stuck, the face quality in the hotel, thank you, Emma. So the face of this guy, I knew him, but not too much to remember his name. So I went when the mortars just calmed down. Tell him, where do I know you from? قال لي والله يا أستاذ, we were in the morning. I was serving you coffee in the morning. What are you doing with a gun now? If you were serving me coffee in the morning, you're working at the hotel. شو هتعمل هون with a gun? He said, في مصاري. There is money involved. So this is something that also I can say in a different, different circumstances. I also saw this in what was called the revolution. What I would like to say, and a solid ground exists for a revolution in Lebanon. A solid ground must give thrust to whatever comes now. But كمان, I have to point out the issue of funding, be it for the media and be it for the whole manifestations in Lebanon. لأنه there was a lot of logistics involved from day one. يعني from day one being organized, معناتها being prepared. I can say something about people in general. Well, if me, Ayman, Dima, and Hatim, who just met, were now taken and thrown in a group of 100 people, we know each other for now, and we were instructed to be organized. Those who are organized will lead those who are not organized, لأنه they know each other. And this, in my opinion, is what happened in the revolution in Lebanon. Those who were organized were trying to channel the energy that was there. لأنه كمان there was very authentic people. I had one of these people, like Ayman said, there were people who were at 12:12 that night. I had this lady. I remember her well. I called a certain. I received a certain call from جمعية البركة, بيت البركة, who was willing to help her. She came from Daura to Juni just to go on the mic and say that her mom is dying at home. She doesn't have medicine. She doesn't have food, and she was crying on the microphone. Luckily, I got to her. So she got her voice out, and I got a call. Hada wants to help her. Someone wants to help her. So this person, I have no doubt, she was very honest in her approach. She was dying from the inside, and she was just there to say, "Khalas, I had enough of this system." But on the other part of the revolutions, on day 1, 2, 3, until day 60, there was a channel that was leading to a certain political message. Yani, I've heard people telling to others, please مثلا say this about that or say this about that. يعني كان في نوع, there was a kind of, which I don't think, I'm not saying it's wrong or right, but what I'm saying is that there was obviously a deep plan not to show political involvement, but at the end we all knew that there was something political also involved about it. And I mean traditional political parties, which were once in the same cabinet, which were once they shared the same responsibilities, and they were all associates to get us to where we are today. I just want to sum up by comparing two things. In 2015, if I get my dates right, there was a movement in Lebanon. How did the media deal with this movement? It was demonized at a certain point. It took some coverage, but بعدين صاروا هول الزعران, those thugs who were just getting, who were hitting the hotels and were some communists or leftovers of communists. This was the label that people were saying to these people who tried to do something in 2015. In 2020, those who categorized them, 2019, sorry, those who categorized them and who I know are politically affiliated were the same people to say, no, this is the true revolution. Who categorizes a true revolution from a fake one? يعني I told someone, قلت له مش أنت, aren't you the one who called these people who were cutting roads, who were involved in downtown Beirut as leftovers of communism? How come that now you trust in what's happening in Lebanon? And here, it was just over a month after that I knew that something or someone was also involved in what was happening in Lebanon. So that's my account of things. Perhaps take a different approach, but this is what I had to say. Thank you.
Thank you, George. Very controversial. I agree and disagree on so many points, but I cannot refrain myself from commenting on just one point. Definitely, you can find people who are not politically affiliated in Lebanon. So definitely they do exist. They are real, but they do exist. So, and another thing concerning the logistics of the revolution. So one of the points that we criticize when we assess the revolution is that it was a leaderless revolt and it wasn't organized. And then when we have Mnaish, then we are also somehow criticized. So no matter what you do in Lebanon, you cannot satisfy everybody, and you always have like this criticism somehow. So it's very difficult to assess all what happened because we're still like in the middle of it. And this is why maybe we have this diversity in opinions. And thank you very much for bringing us the other side of the story. So thank you very much, George. Very technical, very practical. Now we will move with a wrap up with Dr. Adel Iskandar. Dr. Adel Iskandar is an assistant professor of global communication at Simon Fraser University in Canada. He is the author, co-author, and editor of several works. His research agenda involves showcasing local creative production by communities in the Middle East to confront the rise of extremism. Adel, you will have 10 minutes. I actually added, or I moved from 8 minutes to 10 minutes because I think I don't envy you on your situation. I think you have a lot to wrap up and to say.
Can you hear me now?
Perfect
Yeah.
now.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much, Maria. If you don't mind, I'm just going to withhold everybody's titles, just because it makes more sense and it's smoother that way. I just want to say that it's a real honor and privilege for me to be a discussant on this panel, because I've learned so much. I'm really just so invigorated by all the presentations. I'm learning a tremendous amount about the Lebanese context and circumstances. I also want to note that, Maria, you and I will remember this, but exactly 4 years, is it 5 years ago to the day, we were at AUB, at the Asfari Institute, talking about digital activism and the media in North Africa, in the Middle East and North Africa. And we were talking about these exact same themes, but with a more specific and designated focus on the uprisings that happened in the region. And Lebanon was sort of the fringe discussion, or sort of, it was a lateral discussion to that debate. And we were at the time talking about Talat Rihatkum and various other sort of movements, and whether or not those might percolate and become something more congealed, meaningful, and whether or not they would question and challenge the structural system in place. Lo and behold, we're here now talking about this. So hindsight is always 2020, if you will. I want to say that I really have so much to reflect on in all of your presentations, but if you don't mind, I'm just going to try and speak as fast as I can, and if it's discombobulated, I apologize in advance. There's so many remarkable themes presented here. I'm going to start with Hatem's presentation, which in my opinion was overarching, holistic, and brought about some real meaningful discussions around concepts and issues that we try to bring to bear in our research as academics. The question around what constitutes a revolutionary moment, the idea of live and streaming, and I could see the connections between what Hatem was describing and George's actual kind of on the ground attempt to tell the stories, you know? So, and it's just really amazing to see the how decision-making happens and why decision-making happens, whether or not to go live, and what the political interests and repercussions and ramifications of doing so might be. Hatem also posits this question of sort of temporality and what to portray and when to portray it. Is this a singular event that exists in a moment of time, or is it part of a long-standing situation? It is part of an endemic problem. And I know we talk about that in regards to political events. Is this a single protest, or is it a revolutionary movement? Is it part of the long-standing commitment of a political party, or is it a group of unaffiliated individuals who happen to come together? Is it mobilized online, or is it mobilized in backroom offices of political parties? All of these things have a meaningful impact once they face the public. And those are the incredible and hefty weight of being able to tell those stories is a huge responsibility on the part of journalists and reporters. But at the same time, they're beholden to institutions that pay the bills, right? And so we have to be cognizant of that negotiation. Hatem also brings the discussion around, and I want to come back to this, like this dissonant temporality, right? The idea of like, do we accept this as a single moment, or do we assume that this has long implications? And those are problems that we face both as activists, or as academics, or as journalists trying to report. How do you describe what is happening before your eyes? And then also Hatem gets into the discussion around who gets to narrate and who gets to tell the story. The average person on the street, the folks with cameras who become part of the story, or become the real narrators when the traditional media fail at their presumed responsibility? Or is it the talk shows that have their own implications because they're connected to political parties and powers that be? So authorities are closest to the anchors and the assignment editors and the higher up or the higher echelon of the news media. But then you've got the foot soldiers, right? The folks who are on the ground doing the Instagram stories or doing all these things. But the question becomes, are they really that far apart from each other? And what narratives produced on the ground can help reinforce existing discussions in these upper echelons. The one thing that is cross-cutting for me is this issue of like, simultaneity and liveness and what liveness means, right? Because we have this ingrained assumption that if it is live, it's real, right? Everything that is live is real. If I'm watching it streaming, like this discussion now is absolutely real, right? In the eyes of those who are watching it. And so, but of course, there's always the antagonism, which is to say, what is live is not necessarily real because it is framed, right? So if I were to shift my camera this way, you'll see that the entire basement is full of clutter, and that this is the part that I want you to see, So I framed this a particular way. And so the question around liveness is really quite critical, and Hatem brings that to bear. So all the questions that Hatem, helped us grapple with, including the notions of affective proximity from Omar's work, is so critical, because that is the way in which we react as audiences and members of the public, and as mobilized members of social movements. We react to the affect and the degree of proximity that we have to it. In Dima's presentation, I was so enamored by how holistic it is. I mean, there's just so much here, so much content, so much detail. The sort of the contrast between traditional media and alternative media was something that I found really compelling. I'm interested in a lot of Chris Atten's work around what constitutes alternative media, and I found that the questions here were really quite critical. The ideas around space and affect and agency and decision making. But one of the things I really enjoyed about your presentation, Dima, is how you took us through this journey where the explosion becomes like a real turning point in how discussions within the media get framed. So even the way that you narrated the explosion was kind of a moment of fracture. But then you came back and told us a little bit more about how October 17th was depicted and represented. The real problems in my mind around discussing revolutionary movements and their representation and their framing is around notions of mobilization and unification. Like, what does it mean to be unifying? Because a lot of this stuff is really performative. The performance of unification and the performance of mobilization, like what type of narratives to use. Like, one of the things that you brought to bear, which is really interesting, is the use of language. Which language to deploy and for what reason? Well, then if we decide to use Arabic as the lingua franca for the revolution, then we automatically decide that there are some contingencies and some identities and some perceived relationships to the revolution are now the new fringe. So all of a sudden the cosmopolitanism of Lebanon becomes a burden that needs to be negotiated in this revolution, where people don't have agreeable kind of identities that are meaningful. I'm thinking of like Marwan Craidy's work about globalization. Well, globalization works really well when everybody's in concert. But what happens when these divisions start taking place and these sort of existential kind of clusters that are the political parties and their reach and their means are so disenfranchised from each other that you don't see eye to eye. So trying to bring together a revolutionary movement where everybody's in agreement around a political class that are corrupt and they all see eye to eye is so incredibly difficult. So I'm going to bring, if you don't mind, I'm going to bring I don't mean to suggest that there is kind of interchangeability between the Egyptian context or Tunisian context and the Lebanese context, but there are definitely lessons to be learned. One of the things that we saw in virtually all of the protest movements and revolutionary actions and uprisings in the region has been the two things. One, and I think they come into this discussion quite aptly. One is the really quick ability on the part of the political class and to reinvent themselves, to appropriate revolution. If they weren't part of it to begin with, they're very quick at and very nimble at appropriating it, dismantling it, and those are really, really telling questions. Ayman, your presentation really presented that in a meaningful way to me, because the way that you decided to analyze and describe to us the three business-owned networks and how they operated and how they ended up reinforcing the status quo is literally like textbook what happened in, let's say, Egypt, you know, where, I mean, there are expressions that became part of our nomenclature, our glossary of thinking about things like talabat fi'awiyya. You know, you have like sectarian demands, not sectarian, but like factional demands. Like, oh, you want to eat? Oh, okay, so that's it. It's not really about corruption. And so you begin to kind of dismantle and disaggregate and shift the news agenda in such a way that it no longer becomes a holistic revolution representative of everyone there. And those are very, very remarkable kind of strategic approaches. The focus on violence, even the questions like, why are you here? You know, what brought them out? Why are they dressed the way they do? Look at all these, and also the cliches and the focus on the gimmickiness of things, or how carnivalesque it is. Sometimes it looks like a party, so it can't really be a political. You know, all of those things are ways to kind of dismantle the meaningful kind of protest movement. The one thing that well, one of the many things I took from your presentation, Ayman, is this idea of whether or not we can think about the revolution as having produced the desirable outcomes. And what does it mean for a revolution to regress? You know, like, can a revolution regress? Can it fail? And what are the metrics on which those things are discussed? If the discussion is about isqat al-nizam, then where is the nizam as it stands today? You know, and so I'm not asking it in that sense, but I'm curious as to how this negotiation of what it means for the nizam to be sustained moving forward. I have my own sort of views on things, and I'm gonna use this platform to kind of push them in some regards. It's a personal plug for me, but I believe that the reincarnation of the news media in the aftermath of protest movements like the revolution in Lebanon and Egypt and elsewhere is neoliberal authoritarianism, right? Where basically the idea that political parties in the traditional sense running news organizations is not going to be the future. Quite the contrary. You need a business class that is married to the political parties, and they can perform authenticity and perform distance from the status quo and distance from the elite, but at the same time to do so with neoliberalism at the core. So whoever pays the bills gets to call the shots. So if Ayman, your organization is prepared to pay the bills, you may be able to call the shots, but you may not be able to call the shots for a brief amount of time, right? Until somebody else with a lot more money comes in. The Egyptian context is very telling because that's exactly what happened for about 5 years until the military establishment and its own connections came in and essentially bought out every single news organization so that you have harmonized media across the board. So that is just something worth thinking about. George, your presentation, and I'm sorry, I'm like really rushing through this, but I'm really, really enjoying, there's so much to say about all your presentations. George, the way you describe things to me, and I know this sounds really simplistic and almost gimmicky as well, but I keep thinking about not only the media system, but also the political parties, as well as the societal reach and the tentacles of those two into the mass, into the public at large, almost like a pizza, right? Like each slice of the pizza, like everybody, you know how like when you order pizza and you would decide, I want this toppings on this side, this toppings on that side. If you have a lot of kids, that's what you end up doing, right? But if everybody gets their own slice and they want what they want in it, and so the media diet of our public is also contingent on their political affiliations. So people are watching what they want to watch because they selected it on the basis of what they agree with. So what happens if these news organizations stop delivering people the diet that you want? If you pull the pepperoni off that slice, I don't want that slice anymore, you know? And that's where things get really complicated. Right now, I think we have a political psyche in many parts of the region, but also in Lebanon, where people can very easily default back to what they know best. And so maybe there, as Maria agreed, there are absolutely independent people, and this movement could not have been sustained and substantiated in the way that it has if it wasn't for a huge and growing contingency of young people who are committed to move things beyond beyond the status quo. But at the same time, when, I hate to say it, when shit hits the fan, what do you fall back on? And right now, the entrenched structures reinforce the status quo. Political parties are also paying. They're paying in the same way that news organizations are paying to get what they want, done. The moment that they run out of money, they will lose steam and they become less effectual. But we have to, I think what the tension here is between thinking about mainstream or sort of traditional media or legacy media in one sense, and these new alternative platforms in another sense. And so I would caution against us seeing them as so diametrically opposed and so diametrically different that they are completely apart. Because you will see, and I know you see this in Lebanon quite often, that people will follow the buck, right? Sometimes you'll see somebody who works for a mainstream news organization and they make money here, but then as soon as the money runs dry and an alternative news organization has a freelance job, they'll move there. And then they might be able to do 3 or 4 jobs simultaneously. So you see the same characters kind of rotating between those, which is an indication that we just don't have the financial luxury to be able to choose the jobs that we want as journalists, as reporters, as freelancers, right? So it is perfectly reasonable to chase the buck. The other question that is cross-cutting across the board for everyone that I thought was really important is this issue of authenticity. Everybody talked about authenticity in one way, shape, or form. And I find that to be really compelling because it raises the question of whether or not we are actually capable of authenticating. I mean, we can claim that we're able to authenticate video footage and content of the sort, but can we authenticate people's intentions? And I think that's the big question around revolutionary impulses. Is it a real revolution? Is it not a real revolution? Is a real revolution an unaffiliated revolution? Historically, if we think about revolutions, whether the French, the Bolshevik, or others, most of them do have a political ideology, right? They do have a political ideology. There are political parties behind them. So why is it that in the Middle East, we expect and want revolutionary movements to not have leaders, to not have institutions behind them, to not have social movements behind them? Why can't it be a leftist or an Islamist revolution, right? It's almost like we're trying to build consensus by shedding all of our political kind of knowledge and understanding, which makes it extremely easy to take advantage of these revolutions. It was so I mean, we thought, I mean, I say we, as somebody who's very sentimentally connected to the Egyptian revolution, we thought that to be leaderless is an asset, right? It's an asset, it's remarkable. You can't go after our leaders because we are the masses. But guess what? When it's time to move into the negotiating table, who's there to speak on your behalf? What are you negotiating? And of course, that becomes a remarkable way to disenfranchise based on representation in media. The media framing of a revolution that is leaderless, after a while, it's done, you know? And it becomes really problematic to sustain that. So the questions around authenticity are deeply, deeply rooted in these questions. And the last thing I'm going to say is kind of to invite us to think about how a lot of this is about iconography. And I think, Dima, you may have said, somebody mentioned iconography. I think it was you, Dima. I think that is really, in my opinion, and of course, I may be extremely cynical coming from, you know, after 10 years of the Egyptian revolution, all that remains is a hashtag behind me, you know, but the iconography is so absolutely critical in consecrating and memorializing and keeping the idea of a revolution alive. It may not be alive. It may be an effigy. It may be something that just doesn't exist anymore, but it is part of the collective memory through experience. So the question is, which will preside and which will prevail against the rubric of what currently exists? The Lebanese context is, and especially, you know, this year, the year that has October 17 and the explosion, is so hefty in transformation, almost to the extent that it's puzzling to think about them in tandem with each other. There's more that happened in 1 year than one could begin to process and understand. And so the question becomes, who gets to tell the story? And the media in Lebanon, as you know, I remember historically we would often say that the media system in Lebanon is so incredibly diverse, and to consider that an asset. Well, then maybe in some instances the diversity in and of itself, especially when it's connected to systems of interest, is not really an asset. Quite the contrary, that it becomes a liability for getting change to happen, for building a unified movement, for having audiences genuinely believe in meaningful change. But all this to say, I'm just really inspired by everything that's been said, and I look forward to our discussion to follow. But I'm sorry, bear with me for not knowing so much about the Lebanese context, but I genuinely enjoyed every single thing that you said. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Adel. Thank you for putting things in this very coherent way. So I will also leave you with the floor to ask questions to our speakers if you have any specific questions, but I will abuse my authority as a moderator, and I will address the first question to George, because I want to ask a question that is related to this 24 hours coverage that was mentioned by Hatem, by Ayman, and by somehow all of us. So, George, do you think that also this 24 hours coverage and the live coverage and the reporters going to the streets asking this question of why you are here, أوليش أنتوا هون, do you think that it also has a financial perspective? So because they say that the live is cheap and the financial resources of the TV stations, particularly right now, are somehow scarce. So do you think that this also is an agenda in itself? You are on mute, George.
It's a very beautiful question, might I say. لأنه it's at the root of one of the things that has been asked, and I have responded to that at some point before to the media. To ask this question is the same like when I said about logistics. Logistics, when it comes along after 1 week, 1 month, it's normal. لأنه we get along, things happen. You got people who volunteer, people who put in some money, not necessarily political people, just people who are in for a change. So, but logistics at 0 hour is something to ask. لأنه عادة at 0 hour, people will not be prepared for such a thing. Sandwiches, water, pickups, emptying, let's say, whole الدواليب, right? The word escaped. So anyway, it's the same thing when we talk about the media. The media, the live coverage doesn't cost in itself, but getting a car out there, and paying fuel, getting a camera out there is risking to break it. Getting a reporter out there is overworking him, her. So there is a use of more resources. There is a use of the station itself, electricity, all of this. All of the stations in Lebanon were ready to offer this. What I'm saying, I'm asking a question, I'm not deducing. I don't have a data to confirm if there was an agenda or not. But based on my 17 years of work, I didn't see it happen very often. At least not with these 3 business-oriented TVs. So whenever they push in to put this effort, there must be a reason. Tonight and before, I was searching for this reason.
Adel, would you like to address specific questions to our speakers?
I would like to invite Ayman and George to tell us a little bit more about this issue of where opportunity lies when funding streams change. Ayman, what you posit as an opportunity, I want to ask you a little bit more about whether or not you feel that there's a way to kind of sustain this sufficiently for there to be institutional change. I know that we're starting kind of at the bottom with, it's almost like the grassroots of news organizations, reporters having to do stories and then eventually kind of pushing the assignment desk to run them. But I mean, in terms of the sustaining funding is usually the problem. I look at the example of, for instance, the only living example in Egypt of something akin to that is Mada Masr, right? And you know, it's been a huge struggle. And when the government decides to block it or, you know, make it inaccessible in some ways, then the reach and the impact also becomes quite minuscule. So obviously you're not facing the same kind of governmental pressure in Lebanon, but as far as that long breath, nafas al-tawil, like can this be sustained? And is the idea to kind of change the culture more specifically? And then I would like to hear George's perspective on, you know, is it really all about the big bucks? You know, like, and that's really what it will fundamentally change things. If there is a benefactor in Egypt, for instance, I'll give you an example, like Najib Sawiris invested billions of dollars, I don't know, maybe not billions, but like hundreds of millions of dollars to run a television network that was pushing progressive agendas and in some instances supported the revolution. But when push comes to shove, you know, he had to jump ship, and then that's it, you know, and then it dies down, and everybody goes back to where they belonged, you know, even though there was a culture shift in some regards, you know, the Yusri Fudas are in exile, and the, you know, that's it. So you kind of move on. So does this need to be sustained, and what does this sustained idea translate into? And is there a future for alternative journalism beyond just those small kind of packages of produced, you know, content that young people put out with the hope of reaching larger publics?
Okay, so let us take Ayman, and then we will also hear from George about his opinion on this question. Yes, Ayman.
Thank you, Adil. You know, the question of media sustainability is actually one of the most recurrent questions all over the world. It's very difficult to make money out of money. And you need money to make money as well. Both are very important in the media sector all over the world, because the idea of free as in like paying with my data actually, but I mean, not physically paying for information is something, is a global problem. But in the Lebanese context in particular, I'll go back, I understand your point about the dichotomy not being that strong, but at least at the level of owners and at the level of managers, it is strong. It's difficult to find people doing the back and forth at the managerial level. When it comes to the big traditional media, we all agree. If there is funding, they will follow, but it's not necessarily sustainable. What can be sustainable are the skills that individual journalists who worked according to the highest standards on specific issues will acquire, and they will be able to keep these skills and use them in different instances. I mean, I always give the example of Riyad Qubaisi. According to the outlet where he is publishing an investigation, we see differences, and it's understandable. I mean, now when it comes to the alternative media outlets, some of the new ones, and the Mada Masr example is a very important one. There is no magic wand or one solution. It very much depends on the local culture, on how people consume. And we need to take all these options into consideration and try to find the best package. And today, many of our programs, many of the international programs are focusing so much on this issue of sustainability. We're no longer in 2012, 2013, 14, where we are pushing for the establishment of media startups. I think today it's time to take some of these successful startups and turn them into more sustainable, organizations. The options exist are, one, trying to create systems for subscription without creating paywalls, without creating exclusive access to information only for the wealthiest. And there are creative models being discussed, specifically when it comes to pooling subscriptions. So by actually buying, exactly like you top up your phone with a prepaid card, you have access to a variety of outlets, and it's paper article, it's deducted from your credit, and once you reach the lowest bottom, you can recharge it the same way you do it for your phone at a price that is very much in line with people's consumption patterns. This is just one example. Another example we're working on are to leverage some of the amazing qualities that these media organizations have. For example, Mada Masr does amazing infographics. And I know that Mada Masr can monetize these infographics and use it for, to sustain their activity. And the same applies to an organization like Daraj, which is led by two of the most amazing documentary producers in Lebanon. So by actually doing documentaries for profit and reinvesting a part of this into Daraj, they were able to do amazing work. And this is something that we're working with the organizations to try to identify. We're also working on smart use of and digital right respectful use of readers' data to better understand how the user interface, the user experience can actually change and be more adapted to create more loyalty, but not from the perspective of keeping me hostage in my bubble. And there are amazing Lebanese organizations. I'll give you the example of Klangu, one of the leading global startups on the issue of user loyalty based on how you consume your media. And finally, we released a study just in April that is on our website, Economic Outlook for the Independent Media Sector, that actually shows that in Lebanon, in Tunisia, in Egypt, and Jordan, but we mainly focus on Lebanon and Jordan, this one, there is a startup in the business sector of young entrepreneurs who are not part of the economic mafia, who are not part of the same business political elite, that share our values, progressive values, rule of law-based values. And they don't have access to the advertising market that is controlled by, the big players. And they do have amazing design products, amazing hospitality business, amazing food and beverage business that need to be advertised and target the same readers who read Mada Masr and Megaphone and Daraj on the others. Can we facilitate, as an organization in partnership with all of them, a smart understanding of responsible advertising market for independent media in sectors that are still surviving in Lebanon against all odds? We believe that there is something to explore there, and we're very much invested in this avenue. So we're not sure we're gonna win, but we will put every single effort necessary to provide them with the sustainability they deserve, to disconnect them from donor cycles that are very cyclical. Today they're interested, and most money is coming for content production because they're interested in issues of disinformation and things like that. Once this, and it was countering violent extremism 5 years ago, and suddenly the money disappeared. So now let's try to avoid being hostage of these cycles by exploring all these ideas that I mentioned earlier. I'm really sorry I have to leave now. I'll definitely listen to the rest of the conversation on Facebook, and thank you very much for this amazing conversation.
Thank you, Ayman, for your presence and your insights. It was really valuable. George, would you like to add anything concerning this question, the question addressed by Adil?
To answer Adil, and thank you for his question, he brought up a very important point between Lebanon and Egypt. This is a personal point of view, but when I look at Egypt, there are fundamental differences with Lebanon, which touch down on identity. I'm sorry to be blunt and to say that in Lebanon, I have come to conclude after so many years living there, that we do have, at least a big chunk of Lebanese, have a crisis of identity. You will find a big chunk of Lebanese who want an Islamic Republic that looks something like Iran. And this is a faction that I cannot ignore. If it's not my opinion, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I have another faction in Lebanon that says, they want everything to do and happen to them, but at least our leader is happy. Although they have to sit at the door in hospitals, they have to pay 17 times the price of something at the supermarket. This chunk of people exists. And then you have those who consider that they are Phoenicians, and others that they consider that they are Arabs. And you have a faction that considers Lebanon is not a country, that we are part of Syria. So all of this is just how much our civil education was badly done since independence. And this touches down on the green problem of Lebanon. This is something very different from what you have in Egypt, which is loyalty to the army, loyalty to the land, one plan ahead. I'm Egyptian, I know who I am. Okay, we have differences in politics. Someone wants another leader, he wants this political party, he wants this, but you have a basic idea of what Egyptian is. What is it to be Egyptian? The patriotism, the belonging to the land, to the idea, to the constitution, to the idea of Egypt. The idea of Lebanon is different from one region to the other in Lebanon, and from one political entity to another. And this has really aborted any revolution that has started in Lebanon through the years, 2005, and now recently. So sustainability is not only about money. Sustainability is about civic education. And I have to say something. I'm not talking acute about Samir Qasir Foundation. It's a very reputable foundation that I've worked with. But the money that went to the foundations and to some of the NGOs after the blast were
were misused. يعني I have been there وكان في كثير شكاوى, and people were complaining that some institutions used to come with 7 stickers, 1 box of food. They would stick the first sticker, take a photo, stick the second sticker above it, take a photo. 1 box sold 7 times to 1 guy. So هيدي كمان, it shows that at the base we go back to the people themselves being not transparent. Civic education, that's the point. So this is why I do agree, you know, that the thing about sustainability in Lebanon is a big question that should be really under the limelight.
Thank you, George. Actually, you're talking about the organizations that worked in the relief part after the blast, and I totally agree with you. And I'm writing a paper actually about this point and the lack of cooperation between different NGOs after the blast and between the NGOs. But after all, the conclusion will be that if there were no NGOs, there was nothing. So because the government is totally absent. So thank you, George, for this honest answer. Adil, let's ask the last question because we're really running out of time. So would you like to ask the last question?
Yes, if you don't mind, I'm gonna do something similar to what I did with Ayman and George. For both yourselves, Hatem and Dima. And this is in light of what both Ayman and George have addressed, this issue of like culture, identity, and what that means. We often think about revolutions as an opportunity to either have a breakthrough in the political culture and also to possibly consecrate new cultural patterns, ideas, images, representations. So, and both of you spoke to that in one degree or another. So I'm curious if you can share with us what you feel those moments, because both of you focused on October 17th as sort of an impetus and a starting point in the discussion, not reducing it to that, and of course, and both of you historicized the preceding moments, but nevertheless, I'm curious, what does October 17th mean? Culturally speaking, moving forward, and what the implications of those cultural outcomes might be. Dima, I know you gave us really sort of tangible examples of that, but let's imagine 5, 6, 10, 15 years down the road. What does October 17th look like? How will it be commemorated and remembered?
Thank you, Adil. You know, there's so many different factors that go into this. And like George was saying, we definitely do have this kind of identity crisis. And, you know, October 17 and the spaces that were there kind of showcased this, the different crises that were going on, whether it be through music. And, you know, because sound and music are kind of my, you know, my interests, I'm going to, sorry, my son has just walked in. You know, I'm going to kind of focus and look at how, you know, culture and music play a part in this kind of understanding of identity. And, you know, the reason why I gave the Chimera example with the Majid al-Rumi song was specifically for this reason, was that, you know, Majid al-Rumi is somebody that is seen as a Lebanese icon. I mean, you know, her songs about revolution, her songs about different, you know, about different topics are something that, you know, maybe the older Lebanese you know, kind of listen to and appreciate. I'm not saying the younger ones don't, but you know, that's kind of the generation. And then when they kind of try to take that song on and give it a different life, there was a lot of backlash behind it, because, you know, this idea of heavy metal, this idea of, you know, music and metal and how metal music it doesn't represent the Lebanese kind of identity. Yes, so sorry, he's like very adamant about the gum. But then it's this idea as well, is, you know, when we're talking about revolutions, I know Adil, you know, you looked at Egypt and other countries as well. You know, the way that music played a big part in them, in Tunisia and in Egypt. You know, there were certain artists that kind of came out of the revolution. You know, and a lot of them, you know, there were heavy metal singers. It wasn't necessarily this kind of like traditional Arab singer that kind of came out. And so I'm just to answer your kind of question, this idea of culture and identity. I really don't know, because, you know, there's always kind of like this need to go back, this nostalgic need of the Lebanese to kind of go back to appropriate the old, you know, even though there are newer kind of forms of music coming out, newer forms of identities that can kind of emerge from this. I know this idea that, you know, a younger, and one of the participants actually said this to me, and I thought this was really interesting, is that, you know, younger, you know, people in Lebanon, the youth, because of October 17th, had more of a kind of interest in politics because they were kind of living through some movement. And again, there's a lot of problems with this movement. Please don't, I'm not trying to romanticize October 17th in any way. There are a lot of issues there, the issues of identity being one of them, but this idea that there was an interest in politics. And like George was saying, we have this huge kind of issue with trying to move away from our old beliefs, whether it be through music, whether it be through religion, whether it be through politics. People are born into their political parties. And at the end of the day, even if they try to be kind of progressive, to scratch the surface, it always comes out. And I saw this with my students as well during October 17th. I was really excited, like, let's do this, whatever. And then you listen to them and then you hear what they're saying. You're like, actually, كلهم doesn't apply to their zaim or so ever. So this is just the way that I see kind of this idea of culture and identity.
Thank you, Dima. Hatem.
Thanks, Dima, for bringing in this conversation about music. It's striking to me. I remember when I was a teenager, people insisting to me that there was nothing Lebanese or Arabic about heavy metal, even as I was listening to Lebanese and Arab heavy metal bands like 3 decades ago. So at the very least, there's a tradition of Lebanese heavy metal. We're talking about revolutions and revolutionary frames. And I really appreciated hearing from George, Ayman, and Dima about sort of how different organizational forms lead to different types of content. And each of us, I think, has, at least in our mind, a sense of how the economics underpins this. But if you're talking about revolution, I don't think our horizon of what might be possible or desirable should be limited by the limitations of our moment. Like, some people are now trying to have a conversation about not only like how do you sustain journalism in light of neoliberal authoritarianism on the one hand, and it's very difficult to make money from journalism on the other. Mm. Why not try to rework the idea of public media, which doesn't either turn into state-run media or, on the other hand, something which is left to the vicissitudes of patronage, or forms of taxation which are based on like paywalls and usage, which ends up being a regressive way of funding what might be understood to be a public good. What maybe like Lebanon in particular has serious challenges to this, right? There's both no sort of strong tradition of Sultan Arab like in Egypt, or like a strong state-run mission, like with like a civic mission to educate its citizenry. But on the other hand, we have all these militias with their own outward outlets and really talented people trying to do the types of things that were described here as alternative media. But what might like publicly funded media look like? And specifically, I mean, the type of publicly funded media where funding does not translate to editorial control by the state. Funding does not lead to political co-optation by a funding body or a parliament. There are models that like this that people discuss.